René Guénon, 7 Essays on Tradition. Ancient Empiricism, Psychic Residues, The Inversion of Symbols, The Social Chaos, The Superstition of Values, The Misdeeds of Psychoanalysis, Thunderbolts. The Empiricism of the Ancients. On numerous occasions, we have already explained the fundamental difference between the sciences of the ancients and the moderns, which is that between traditional and profane sciences. But this is a question involving so many commonly held errors that it cannot be overemphasized. Thus, it is often affirmed as self-evident that the science of the ancients was purely empirical, which basically amounts to saying that it was not really even a science, strictly speaking, but only a kind of practical and utilitarian knowledge. Now, it is easy to see, on the contrary, that preoccupations of this order have never held such sway among the moderns, and also even without going further back than what is called classical antiquity, that everything concerned with experimentation was considered by the ancients as only constituting knowledge of a very inferior degree. It is not very clear how all of this can be reconciled with the preceding affirmation, and by a remarkable inconsistency, those very people who express the latter almost never failed to reproach the ancients for their disdain of experimentation. The source of the error in question, as also for a multitude of others, is the notion of evolution or progress. By virtue of the latter, it is claimed that all knowledge began in a rudimentary state from which it was to be gradually raised and developed. A sort of crude, primitive simplicity is postulated, which of course cannot be the object of any observation, and it is maintained that everything started from below, as if it were not contradictory to accept that the superior can originate in the inferior. Such a concept is not just any error, but quite specifically a counter-truth. By this we mean it goes right against the grain of the truth, by a strange inversion which is very characteristic of the modern spirit. The truth, on the contrary, is that since the beginning there has been a sort of degradation or continual descent going from spirituality to materiality, that is, from the superior to the inferior, and manifesting itself in all the domains of human activity, and from this, in fairly recent times, sprang the profane sciences, separated from any transcendent principle, and justified solely by the practical applications to which they give rise. For this is in sum all that interests modern man, who cares little for pure knowledge, and who, as we have just said, only attributes his tendencies to the ancients because he cannot even conceive that theirs may have been altogether different, any more than he can imagine that there may exist sciences altogether different in objective and method from those which he himself cultivates exclusively. The same error also implies empiricism, when understood to designate a philosophical theory, that is, the idea, also very modern, that all knowledge derives entirely from experience, and more precisely from perceptible experiences. In reality, this is only one form of the claim that everything comes from below. It is clear that outside of this preconceived notion, there is no reason to support that the first state of all knowledge must have been an empirical state. This comparison between the two meanings of the same word certainly has nothing fortuitous about it, and it could be said that it is the philosophical empiricism of the moderns that leads them to attribute to the ancients a de facto empiricism. Now, it must be admitted that we have never been able to understand even the possibility of such a concept, so much does it seem to us to go against all evidence. That there may be knowledge that does not come from the senses is purely and simply a matter of fact. But the moderns, who claim that they rely only on facts, ignore them or readily deny them when they do not agree with their theories. In short, the existence of this notion of empiricism simply proves that among those who have expressed it and among those who accept it, certain faculties of a suprasensible order, beginning, it goes without saying, with pure intellectual intuition, have entirely disappeared. And the disappearance of these faculties as to their effective exercise, of course, for in spite of everything they subsist in the latent state in every human being. But this kind of atrophy can reach such a degree that their manifestations become completely impossible, and this is indeed what we notice in the great majority of our contemporaries. Generally speaking, the sciences as understood by the moderns, that is to say the secular sciences, actually assume nothing more or less than a rational elaboration of perceptible data. It is therefore they who are truly empirical as to their point of departure, and it could be said that moderns unduly confuse the starting point of their sciences with the origin of all science. Yet even in their sciences there are sometimes diminished or altered vestiges of ancient knowledge, the real nature of which escapes them. And here we are thinking especially of the mathematical sciences, the essential concepts of which cannot be drawn from sensory experience. The efforts of certain philosophers to explain empirically the origin of these ideas is at times irresistibly comical, and if some attempted to protest when we speak of diminishment or alteration for the worse, we will ask them to compare in this regard, for example, the traditional science of numbers to profane arithmetic. No doubt they will then be able to understand quite easily what is meant. Moreover, most of the profane sciences really owe their origin only to fragments, or even one could say to residues, from misunderstood traditional sciences. Elsewhere we have mentioned as particularly characteristic the example of chemistry, which arose not from genuine alchemy but from its denaturation by puffers, that is, by the profane, who, ignorant of the true meaning of hermetic symbols, understood them in a crudely literal sense. We have also cited the case of astronomy, which represents only the material portion of ancient astrology, isolated from everything that constitutes the spirit of this science, and irremediably lost to moderns, who go off spouting foolishly that astronomy was discovered in a totally empirical way by Chaldean shepherds, without suspecting that those Chaldean shepherds was really the designation of a priestly caste. We could multiply examples of the same kind to establish a comparison between sacred cosmogonies and the theory of the nebula and other similar hypotheses, or in another order of idea, to show the generation of medicine from its ancient dignity of sacerdotal art, and so on. The conclusion would always be the same. Secular people, having illegitimately taken over fragments of knowledge of which they can grasp neither the scope nor the significance, have formed so-called independent sciences which are worth just exactly what they themselves are worth, and thus modern science, which has sprung from them, is literally only the science of the ignorant. The traditional sciences, as we have so often said, are characterized essentially by their attachment to transcendent principles, upon which they depend strictly as more or less contingent applications, and this is the complete contrary of empiricism. But the principles necessarily escape the profane, and that is why the latter, even our modern experts, can never really be other than empirical. Since the time when, as a result of the degradation alluded to previously, men have no longer been equally qualified for all knowledge, that is to say, At least since the beginning of the Kali Yuga, the profane became inevitable. However, in order that their truncated and falsified sciences be taken seriously and passed for what it is not, it was necessary that true knowledge, together with the initiatic organizations which were charged with conserving and transmitting it, disappear. And this is precisely what has happened in the Western world in the course of the last centuries. We should add that in the way moderns envisage the knowledge of the ancients, one may clearly see this negation of any superhuman element which constitutes the basis of the anti-traditional spirit, and which, after all, is only a direct result of ignorance. Not only is everything reduced to purely human proportions, but as a result of this reversal of all things which the evolutionist conception entails, they go so far as to put the infrahuman at the origin. What is most serious is that in the eyes of our contemporaries these things seem to be self-evident, because they no longer even have any inkling that things might be otherwise. They go so far as to state them as if they could not even be disputed, and to present as facts the most unfounded hypotheses. This is most serious, we say, because it is what makes us fear that, having reached such a point, the deviation of the modern spirit may be altogether irremediable. These considerations will help us understand why it is absolutely futile to seek to establish any accord or reconciliation whatever between traditional and secular knowledge, and why the first does not have to ask of the second's confirmation, of which it has no need in and of itself. If we stress this, it is because we know how widespread the point of view is today among those who have some idea of traditional doctrines, yet an exterior idea, so to speak, so insufficient to enable one to penetrate their profound nature, as well as to prevent one from being deluded by the false prestige of modern science and its practical applications. The former, by thus putting on the same plane things that are in no way comparable, not only waste their time and effort, but also risk going astray and misleading others into all kinds of false conceptions. And the many varieties of occultism are there to show that the danger is only too real. Psychic residues. Let us make clear that the case of the persistent vestiges of a degenerate tradition like shamanism, that has lost its superior or spiritual part, is fully comparable to the case of the psychic remains left behind by a human being in passing to another state. For these remains can be used for any purpose once they have been abandoned by the spirit. Whether they be made use of consciously by a magician or sorcerer, or unconsciously by spiritualists, the more or less malefic effects that can accrue obviously have nothing to do with the inherent character of the being to whom they belonged before. They are no longer anything but a special category of wandering influences, to use the terminology of the Far Eastern tradition, and they have kept at most a purely illusory likeness to the said being. Comparisons of this kind can only be fully understood if it is remembered that even spiritual influences themselves must necessarily, if they are to come into action in our world, take appropriate supports, first of all in the psychic order, then in the corporeal order itself, so that the result is something analogous to the constitution of a human being. If later on the spiritual influences for any reason withdraw themselves, their former corporeal support, whether places or objects, will nonetheless remain charged with psychic elements that will be all the stronger and more persistent through having previously served as the intermediaries and the instruments of a yet more powerful action. It would be logical to conclude that important traditional and initiatic centers, more or less long since extinct, must in general be the most important potential sources of danger, whether arising from violent reactions provoked in the psychic conglomerates persisting in such places by sheer imprudence, or more especially from the seizure of these elements by black magicians, to use the accepted expression, who could then maneuver them at will in order to obtain results conforming to a plan. The existence of the first of these two sources of danger goes a long way towards explaining the harmful character of certain vestiges of extinct civilizations when they come to be exhumed by people who, like the modern archaeologists, know nothing of such matters, and so inevitably fall to act with prudence. That is not to say that a particular ancient civilization may not have degenerated through an excessive development of magic in its final phases, and its remains will naturally then always bear the imprint of that development in the shape of psychic influences of a very inferior order. But apart from this genre of consideration, persistent psychic influences, when deprived of the spirit that formerly directed them, are reduced to a sort of larval state, and can easily by themselves react to a particular provocation, however involuntary it may be, in a more or less disordered manner, and in any case in a manner quite unrelated to the intentions of those who used them formerly for purposes of quite another order. Just in the same way, the gruesome manifestations of psychic corpses that sometimes occur in spiritualist seances have absolutely no relation in any circumstances whatever to the possibilities of action or of desire of the individuals whose subtle forms they wear, and whose posthumous identity they initiate more or less badly. In addition, these same influences are at the mercy of anyone who knows how to capture them, just as are physical forces. It goes without saying that either can be made to serve the most diverse and even the most contradictory ends, according to the intentions of whoever has taken control of them, and can direct them to his chosen purpose. And when subtle influences are involved, if their controller happens to be a black magician, it is obviously that they will be used by him for a purpose quite contrary to that for which they may have been used in earlier times by the qualified representatives of a regular tradition. There is another case to be considered alongside this one, that of an ancient traditional civilization that lives on, so to speak, for itself alone, in the sense that its degeneration has proceeded to such a point that the spirit has at last withdrawn entirely from it. Certain kinds of knowledge, having nothing of the spiritual in them, and belonging only to the order of contingent applications, may still continue to be transmitted, particularly the more inferior among them, but they will naturally thereafter be liable to every kind of deviation, for they themselves represent nothing more than residues of another kind, the pure doctrine on which they ought normally to depend having disappeared. In this case of the survival, the psychic influences set to work in earlier times by the representatives of the tradition will again be liable to be captured, even without the knowledge of their apparent guardians, who will thenceforth be illegitimate and entirely without real authority. Those who really make use of the influences through them will thus have the advantage of having at their disposal not only so-called inanimate objects as unconscious instruments, but also living men who serve no less well as supports to the influence and whose real existence confers on them a much greater vitality. A tradition deviated to the extent of decadence is really dead as such, just as dead as a tradition that no longer even appears to be in existence. If there were any life left in it, however little, no such subversion could in any event take place, for it consists in nothing but a reversal of what remains of the tradition so as to make it work in a direction by definition anti-traditional. It is, however, as well to add that before things reach that point, and as soon as traditional organizations are so diminished and enfeebled as no longer to be capable of adequate resistance, the more or less direct agents of the adversary can begin to work their way in with a view to hastening the time when subversion will become possible. They are not always sure to succeed, for whatever still has some life can always recover itself. But if death takes place, the enemy will then be found to be, as it were, in possession and ready to take advantage of his position and to use the corpse for his own purposes. The representatives of everything in the Western world that still retains an authentically traditional character, in the exoteric as well as in the initiatic domain, might be thought to have the strongest possible interest in paying attention to this last observation while there is still time, for all around them the menacing signs indicating infiltrations of this kind are unfortunately by no means indiscernible by anyone who knows how to find them. And if the adversary has something to gain by taking possession of places that were the seat of former spiritual centers, it is not solely because of the psychic influences accumulated in them and more or less free to be made use of, but it is also for the very reason that the places are where they are. For of course they were not chosen arbitrarily for the part that had to be played at one time or another and in connection with one traditional form or another. The sacred geography, the knowledge of which determines the choice in question, is susceptible, like every other traditional science, of a contingent order, of being diverted from its legitimate purpose and of being applied inversely. If a place is privileged to serve for the emission and direction of psychic influences when they are operating as vehicles of a spiritual action, it will be no less so when these same psychic influences are used in quite another way and for ends opposed to all spirituality. It may be observed in passing that the danger of the misdirection of certain kinds of knowledge, of which this last is a very clear example, accounts for much of the secrecy that is quite natural in a normal civilization. But the moderns show themselves to be entirely incapable of understanding this, for they commonly mistake what is really a measure designed as far as possible to prevent the misuse of knowledge, for a desire to monopolize that knowledge. And in truth, secrecy only ceases to be effective when the organizations that are the repositories of the knowledge in question allow unqualified individuals to penetrate into their ranks, for these individuals may even be agents of the adversary. And if they are, so one of their first objects will be to discover the secrets. Whether it be a question of the places themselves, of the influences remaining attached to them, or again of knowledge of the kind just mentioned, the old adage, corruptio optimi pessima, may be recalled, and may be applied perhaps more accurately here than in any other case, and moreover, corruption is just the right word, even in its most literal sense, for the residues here concerned are comparable to the products of the decomposition of a once living being, and as all corruption is more or less contagious, these products of the dissolution of things past will themselves exercise, wherever they may be projected, a particularly dissolving and disaggregating action, especially if they are made use of by a will clearly conscious of its objectives. All this may be likened to a sort of necromancy, making use of psychic remains quite other than those of human individuals, and it is by no means the least redoubtable sort, for it has by its nature a field of action far more extensive than that of common witchcraft. Indeed, matters have reached such a point nowadays that our contemporaries must indeed be blind, not to have even the last suspicion of where they stand. The inversion of symbols. Surprise is sometimes expressed at the fact that one and the same symbol can be taken in two senses, which are at least apparently directly contrary to one another. In order to understand this, duality must in the first place be considered as presupposed by all manifestation, and consequently as conditioning manifestation in all its modes, and it must always be traceable therein in one form or another. Any such duality is in truth a complementarism and not an opposition, but two terms that are really complementary can appear from a relatively exterior or contingent point of view to be opposed. All opposition only exists as such at a certain level, for there can be no such thing as an irreducible opposition. At a higher level it is always resolved into a complementarism, in which its two terms are found to be reconciled and harmonized, until they return at last into the unity of the common principle from which they both proceed. It can therefore be said that the point of view of complementarism is, in a certain sense, intermediate between that of opposition and that of unification, and each of these points of view has its good reason and its own value in the order to which it applies. Although the three are obviously not situated at the same level of reality, what matters therefore is to know how to put each aspect into its proper hierarchical place, and not to try to carry it over into a domain in which it would no longer have any valid significance. And there is nothing in any way illegitimate in taking account of two contrary aspects in a symbol, and in addition that the consideration of either of these aspects in no way excludes the other, since each of them is equally true in a particular relation. And lastly, even that by virtue of their correlation, their existence is a single existence. It is therefore a mistake, and incidentally rather a common one, to suppose that the special consideration of one aspect or the other must be peculiar to doctrines or to schools that are themselves in opposition. In such cases everything depends solely on the predominance that may be assigned to one or the other, and sometimes also on the intention with which the symbol is used. For example, as an element taking part in a particular rite, or again as a means of recognition for the members of a particular organization, and this is a point to which we shall return. The fact that the two aspects may be united in one and the same complex symbolical figuration shows clearly that they are not mutually exclusive and can be considered simultaneously, and this duality can be arranged so far as the relative situation of its terms is concerned, either vertically or horizontally, this being an immediate consequence of the cross-shaped arrangement of its quaternary, which can be resolved into two dualities, one vertical and the other horizontal. As an example of the first case, the two triangles of the Seal of Solomon can be cited, and as an example of the second, the two serpents of the caduceus. And it will be noticed that only in the vertical duality are the two terms clearly distinguished one from the other by their reversed position, whereas in the horizontal duality they can appear completely similar or equivalent when considered separately. It can also be said that in the spatial order, the vertical duality is that of up and down and the horizontal of right and left. Though this observation may perhaps seem rather obvious, it nonetheless has its importance because symbolically these two pairs of terms are themselves susceptible of multiple applications, traces of which could without difficulty be found even in current language, showing that matters of very general application are here in question. So much being established in principle, certain consequences may easily be deduced in connection with what could be called the practical use of symbols. But here a consideration of a more special kind must first be introduced, namely that of the case of which the two contrary aspects are taken as benefic and malefic, respectively. It must be made clear that these two terms are used for want of any better, as on previous occasions. They have the disadvantage of leading to a supposition that some more or less moral interpretation is admitted, whereas the words must be understood here in a purely technical sense. The point of view of beneficence or maleficence has its normal place among all others, but it is also from this very point of view, or rather from the misuses to which it leads, that the subversion and interpretation and use of symbolism now to be referred to may arise, a subversion constituting one of the marks characteristic of everything that is derived, consciously or otherwise, from the domain of the counter-initiation, or is more or less directly subject to its influence. This kind of subversion may consist either in attributing to the malefic aspect while continuing to recognize it as such the place that normally belongs to the benefic aspect, even to the point of giving it a sort of supremacy over the latter, or alternatively attributing to symbols a meaning opposite to their legitimate meaning by treating as benefic the aspect that is really malefic, or the other way around. It must also be noted that in accordance with what was said above, a subversion of this kind may not appear visibly in the representation of the symbols, because there are some in which the two contrary aspects are not marked by any outward difference recognizable at first sight. Thus, in the figurations related to what is commonly but improperly called serpent worshipping, it would often be impossible, at least if only the serpent itself were considered, to say a priori whether the agathodaimon or the kakodaimon is symbolized. Hence, many misunderstandings arise, especially on the part of those who are ignorant of the dual significance of the serpent, and attempted to see in it everywhere and always only a malefic symbol, as has been in fact the case for a long time with the generality in the West. And what has been said of the serpent could equally well be applied to many other symbolic animals, for it has become a habit, for one reason or another, no longer to consider more than one of the two opposed aspects in reality borne by these animals. In the case of symbols that can be made to take up two opposite positions, and especially those that are reduced to geometrical forms, it might be thought that the difference ought to be much more clearly apparent. Nevertheless, it is not always so, because the two positions of the same symbol are each capable of carrying a legitimate meaning. Also, because their relation is not necessarily that of beneficence and maleficence, for let it be said once more that relation is only a particular application among all others. What it is important to know in such a case is whether there can be said to be a real intention to invert in such a way as formally to contradict the normal and legitimate value of the symbol. That is why, for example, the use of the inverted triangle is very far from being a sign of black magic, as some people think, although it certainly is so in some cases, namely whenever it is accompanied by an intention to adopt an attitude opposed to what the triangle represents when its apex is turned upwards. Incidentally, it may be remarked that an intentional inversion of this kind can also be applied to words or to formulae in such a way as to form various sorts of reversed mantras, as may be seen in certain of the practices of sorcery, even in the simple country witchcraft such as still exists in the West. Thus it can be seen that the question of the inversion of symbols is rather complicated, and it might well also be described as rather delicate, for in order to know what the real position is in any particular case, it is necessary to examine not so much the figurations seen in what may be called their materiality, as the accompanying interpretations which express the intention that dictated their adoption. And furthermore, the cleverest and most dangerous subversion is not the one that betrays itself by two obvious singularities easily noticed by anyone, but it is the one that deforms the meaning of symbols or reverses their import while making no change in their outward appearance. And the most diabolical trick of all is perhaps that which consists in attributing to the orthodox symbolism itself, as it exists in truly traditional organizations, the inverted interpretation that is specifically characteristic of the counter-initiation, and the counter-initiation does not fail to take advantage of all this method of promoting confusion and uncertainty when it can derive some profit from them. This is really the whole secret of certain campaigns, very significant in view of the character of the present period, conducted either against esotericism in general or against any one initiatic form in particular, with the unconscious help of people who would be very astonished and even appalled if they could become aware of the use that is being made of them. Unfortunately, however, it sometimes so happens that people who imagine that they are fighting the devil, whatever their particular notion of the devil may be, are thus turned, without the least suspicion of the fact on their part, into his best servants. The social chaos. If a reconstitution were to be attempted at this level, that is to say, working backwards and starting from consequences rather than from principles, it would be bound to lack any real foundation and would be completely illusory. Nothing stable could ever come out of it, and the whole work would have to be begun anew, because the prime necessity of coming to an agreement on essential truths would have been overlooked. It is for this reason that we find it impossible to consider political contingencies, even in the widest sense of this term, as being anything more than outward signs of the mentality of a period. But even though we regard them in this light, we cannot altogether overlook the manifestations of the modern confusion as they affect the social sphere. Under the present state of affairs in the Western world, nobody any longer occupies the place that he should normally occupy by virtue of his own nature. This is what is meant by saying that the castes no longer exist. For a caste in its traditional meaning is nothing other than the individual's nature, with the whole array of special aptitudes that this carries with it, and that predisposes each man to the fulfillment of one or another particular function. Since the undertaking of a function, no matter of what sort, is no longer dictated by any legitimate rule, the inevitable result is that each person finds himself obliged to do whatever kind of work he can get, often that for which he is the least qualified. The part he plays in the community is determined not by chance, which does not in reality exist, because there are unseen causes, but by what might appear to be chance, that is, by a network of all sorts of incidental circumstances. What exerts the least influence is precisely the one factor that should count for most in the matter, namely the differences of nature between one man and another. It is the negation of these differences, bringing with it the negation of all social hierarchy, that is the cause of the whole disorder. This negation may not have been deliberate at first, and may have been more practical than theoretical, since the mingling of the castes preceded their complete suppression, or, to put it differently, the nature of individuals was misunderstood before it began to be altogether ignored. At all events, this same negation has subsequently been raised by the moderns to the rank of a pseudo-principle under the name of equality. Now, it would be quite easy to show that equality can nowhere exist, for the simple reason that there cannot be two beings who are at the same time really distinct and completely alike in every respect. And it would be no less easy to bring out all the ridiculous consequences arising out of this fantastical idea, in the name of which men claim to impose a complete uniformity on everyone. In such ways, for example, as by meting out identical teachings to all, as though all were equally capable of understanding the same things, and as though the same methods for making them understand these things were suitable for all indiscriminately. However, It could well be asked whether it is not a question of learning rather than understanding. That is to say, whether memory is not put in the place of real intelligence in the modern purely verbal and bookish conception of education, whose object is only the accumulation of rudimentary and heterogeneous notions, and in which quality is sacrificed entirely to quantity, as happens for reasons that we shall explain more fully below, everywhere in the modern world. Here again we have dispersion in multiplicity. Much could be added here concerning the evils of compulsory education, but on these we cannot dwell. When we encounter ideas such as equality or progress, or any of the lay dogmas that almost all of our contemporaries blindly accept, most of which were first formulated during the 18th century, it is not possible for us to say that they arose spontaneously. They are suggestions, in the strictest sense of this word, though they could not, of course, have had any effect in a society that was not already prepared to receive them. Such ideas in themselves have not actually created the mental outlook that is characteristic of modern times, but they have contributed largely to maintaining it and to bringing it to a stage that would doubtless not have been reached without them. If these suggestions were to disappear, the general mentality would come very near to changing direction. And this is why they are so assiduously foisted by all those who have some interest in maintaining the confusion, if not in making it worse, and also why, at a time when it is claimed that everything is open to discussion, they are the only things that may never be discussed. It is not easy to judge the degree of sincerity of those who become propagators of such ideas, or to know to what extent they fall prey to their own lies and deceive themselves as they deceive others. In fact, in propaganda of this sort, those who play the part of dupes often seem to be the best instruments, as they bring to the work a conviction that others would have difficulty simulating, and which is contagious. But behind all this, at least at the outset, a much more deliberate kind of action would have been necessary, and the direction can be set only by men fully cognizant of the real nature of the ideas they are spreading. Well, we say ideas, but it is only very inexactly that this word can be used to apply in the present case, for it is clear that they are by no means real ideas or pure ideas, having absolutely nothing in common with the intellect. They are instead false ideas, or perhaps pseudo-ideas, intended primarily to evoke sentimental reactions, since this is in fact the easiest and most effective way of working on the masses. The particular word that is used is more important than the notion it is supposed to represent, and most of these modern idols are really mere words, for a remarkable phenomenon has arisen known as verbalism, by which sonorous words succeed in creating the illusion of thought, whereas it does not require much reflection to see that it is truly a process of suggestion, altogether comparable to that used by hypnotists. But let us return to the consequences involved by the negation of all true hierarchy. In the present state of affairs, a man does not fulfill his proper function, or only in exceptional cases. And it also happens that the same man is called upon to fulfill successively completely different functions, as though he could change his aptitudes at will. And this may seem paradoxical in an age of extreme specialization, and yet it is in fact the case, especially in the realm of politics. If the competence of specialists is often quite illusory, and in any case limited to a very narrow field. The belief in this competence is nevertheless very strong, and it may well be asked why it is that this belief is not made to apply to the careers of politicians, and why with them the most complete incompetence is seldom an obstacle. A little reflection will show that there is nothing surprising in this, and that it is in fact a very natural outcome of the democratic conception, according to which power comes from below and is based essentially on the majority. For a necessary corollary of this conception is the exclusion of all real competence, which is always at least relatively superior and therefore belongs necessarily to a minority. Considering the point of view at which we place ourselves, these observations will naturally remain entirely aloof from all party questions and all political quarrels with which we will have nothing whatsoever to do. We regard those matters in an absolutely disinterested way, just as we would on any other subject of study, and we wish only to bring out as clearly as possible what lies behind them, which is necessary if all the illusions that our contemporaries harbour on the subject are to be dispelled. The most decisive argument against democracy can be summed up in just a few words. The higher cannot proceed from the lower, because the greater cannot proceed from the lesser. This is an absolute mathematical certainty that nothing can gainsay, and it should be remarked that the same argument applied to a different order of things can also be invoked against materialism. These two attitudes are much more closely linked than might at first appear. It is clear that the people confer a power that they do not themselves possess. True power can only come from above, and this is why, be it said in passing, it can be legitimized only by the sanction of something standing above the social order, that is to say, by a spiritual authority, for otherwise it is a mere counterfeit of power, unjustifiable through any lack of principle. This reversal of the true hierarchical order begins when the temporal power seeks to make itself independent of the spiritual authority, and then even to subordinate the latter by claiming to make it serve political ends. This is an initial usurpation that opens up the way to all the others. Thus, it could be shown, for example, that the French monarchy was itself working unconsciously from the 14th century onwards to prepare the revolution that was to overthrow it. It may be that we shall have the opportunity someday to expound this point of view adequately, but for the moment we can only refer briefly to it in passing. If the word democracy is defined as the government of the people by themselves, it expresses an absolute impossibility and cannot even have a mere de facto existence, in our time or in any other time. One must guard against being misled by words. It is contradictory to say that the same person can be at the same time the ruler and also the ruled, because, to use Aristotelian terminology, the same being cannot be in act and in potency at the same time and in the same relationship. But the great ability of those who are in control in the modern world lies in making the people believe that they are governing themselves, and the people are the more inclined to believe this, and they are flattered by it, and as in any case they are incapable of sufficient reflection to see its impossibility, it was to create this illusion that universal suffrage was invented. The law is supposed to be made by the opinion of the majority, but what is overlooked is that this opinion is something that can very easily be guided or modified. We cannot recall who it was who first spoke of manufacturing opinion. This expression is very apt, although it must be added that it is not always those who are in apparent control who really have the necessary means at their disposal. the incompetence of most politicians seems to have a relative importance only. But since we are not undertaking here to unmask the working of the machine of government, we will do no more than point out that this incompetence itself serves the purpose of keeping up the illusion of which we have been speaking. This now leads us to elucidate more precisely the error of the idea that the majority should make the law. Because even though this idea must remain theoretical, since it does not correspond to any real possibility, it is necessary to explain how it has taken a root in the modern outlook, to which of its tendencies it corresponds, and which of them, at least in appearance, it satisfies. Its most obvious flaw is the one we have just mentioned. The opinion of the majority cannot be anything but an expression of incompetence. Certain observations about mass psychology might be quoted here. That the crowd crystallizes into a sort of general psychosis, whose level is not merely not that of the average, but actually that of the lowest element present. It can be noted that some modern philosophers have even tried to introduce a democratic theory, according to which the opinion of the majority should prevail into the intellectual realm itself, principally by claiming to find a criterion of truth in what they call universal consent. But let us probe more deeply into the question, what is this law of the greatest number which modern governments invoke, and in which they claim to find their sole justification? It is simply the law of matter, of brute force, the same law by which a mass carried down by its weight crushes everything that lies in its tracks. It is precisely here that we find the point of junction of democracy and of materialism. And here also is to be found the reason why this conception is so firmly rooted in the present-day mentality. By this means, the normal order of things is completely reversed and the supremacy of multiplicity as such is upheld. A supremacy that actually only exists in the material world. In the spiritual world, on the other hand, and more clearly still in the universal order, it is unity that is at the summit of a hierarchy, since unity is the principle out of which all multiplicities arise. Once that principle is denied or lost from sight, and nothing remains but multiplicity pure and simple, it is the same thing as matter. And furthermore, the allusion to weight that we have just made has more significance than that of a mere comparison. For in the field of physical forces, in the commonest meaning of the word, weight effectively represents the downward and compressive tendency which involves an ever-increasing limitation of the being, and an ever greater density, a tendency which has been shaping the development of human activity since the beginning of modern times. Matter, owing to its power of both dividing and of limiting, is what philosophy calls the principle of individuation. And this establishes a connection between the questions we are dealing with now and our earlier remarks about individualism. The tendency of which we have just spoken is identical with that individualizing tendency that is represented in the Judeo-Christian tradition as the fall of those who broke away from the original unity. Multiplicity considered apart from its principle and therefore as no longer capable of being reduced to unity, takes a form in the social world of a community only as the arithmetical sum of its component individuals. And the law of such a community is literally that of the greatest number, and it is on this that the democratic idea is based. Finally, one direct consequence of the democratic idea to consider is the negation of the idea of an elite. And it is not for nothing that democracy is opposed to aristocracy. for the latter word, at least when taken in its etymological sense, means precisely the power of an elite. The elite can, by definition, only be the few, and their power, or rather their authority, deriving as it does from their intellectual superiority, has nothing in common with the numerical strength on which democracy is based. A strength whose inherent tendency is to sacrifice the minority to the majority, and therefore quality to quantity and the elite to the masses. The guiding function exercised by a true elite, and its very existence, is utterly incompatible with democracy, which is closely bound up with the egalitarian conception, and therefore with the negation of all hierarchy. The very foundation of the democratic idea is the supposition that one individual is as good as another, simply because they are equal numerically, and in spite of the fact that they can never be equal in any other way, and in spite of the fact that they can never be equal other than on paper. A true elite, as we have already said, can only be an intellectual one, and that is why democracy can arise only where pure intellectuality no longer exists, as is the case in the modern world. But since equality is in fact impossible, and since despite all efforts towards levelling the difference between one man and another cannot in practice be entirely suppressed, men have been brought by a curious illogic to invent false elites, of several kinds, moreover, that claim to take the place of the one true elite, and these false elites are based on a variety of totally relative and contingent points of superiority, always of a material order. This is obvious from the fact that the social distinction that counts most in the present state of things is that based on wealth, that is to say, on a purely outward superiority, or an exclusively quantitative order. And that is the only superiority that is consistent with democracy. It may also be added that even those who set themselves up as opponents of this state of affairs are incapable of producing any real remedy for the disorder, and may even aggravate it by going even further in the same direction, because they also make no appeal to any principle of a higher order. And so the struggle is merely between different varieties of democracy with more or less emphasis on the egalitarian tendency, just as it is, as we have said above, a struggle between the varieties of individualism, which amounts to the same thing. These few reflections seem sufficient to give an idea of the social conditions of the contemporary world, and at the same time to show that there can be only one way out of the chaos, namely the restoration of intellectuality, which would result in the formation once more of a true elite. This elite must be regarded as presently non-existent in the West, since the name cannot be applied to the few isolated and disconnected elements that do no more than represent, so to speak, non-developed possibilities. What they lack is true knowledge and traditional data, which cannot be improvised. Consequently, these are nothing but disjointed efforts, which often go astray owing to a lack of principle and of doctrinal guidance. It might be said that the modern world protects itself by its very dispersion, from which even its adversaries do not succeed in escaping. This will continue to be the case as long as the latter keep to the profane ground on which the modern mentality enjoys an obvious advantage, as this is its proper exclusive province, and as a matter of fact, their remaining on this ground shows that, despite all appearances, this mentality still has a very strong hold over them. It is for this reason that so many people, although moved by undeniably good intentions, are unable to understand that a beginning can be made only from principles, and fritter their energies away in some relative sphere, social or otherwise. The true elite, on the other hand, would not have to intervene directly in these spheres, or take any part in outward action. It would direct everything by an influence of which the powerful were unaware, and which the less visible it was, the more powerful it would really be. It is enough to consider the already mentioned power of suggestion, which does not demand any true intellectuality, in order to get an idea of how much greater would be the power of an influence that was based on pure intellectuality, and worked even more invisibly because of its very nature, instead of this power being lessened by the division inherent in multiplicity, and by the weakness involved by all the lies and illusions. It would, on the contrary, be intensified by concentration on principal unity, and would be one with the strength of truth itself. The superstition of value. In certain of our works, we have denounced a number of specifically modern superstitions, the most striking characteristic of which is that ultimately they rest only on the prestige attributed to a word, a prestige all the greater as the idea evoked by this word is for most people the more vague and inconsistent. The influence exercised by such words themselves, independently of what they express or should express, has in fact never been as great as in our time. It is like a caricature of the power inherent in ritual formulas, and those who are most intent on denying the latter are also, through a singular backlash, the first to allow themselves to adopt what is actually a kind of profane parody. It goes without saying that this power of formulas or words is not at all of the same order in the two instances. The power of ritual formulas, which is essentially based on a sacred science, is something fully effective, and is truly operative in the most diverse domains according to the effects one wishes to obtain. On the contrary, that of their profane counterfeit is naturally only capable, at least directly, of a purely psychological and above all sentimental action. That is, it falls within the most illusory of all domains. This is not to say that such an action is harmless, far from it, for these subjective illusions, however insignificant they may be in themselves, nevertheless have very real consequences in all human activity, and above all, they contribute greatly to the destruction of all true intellectuality, which moreover is probably the chief function assigned them in the plan of the modern subversion. The superstitions of which we speak vary to some extent from moment to moment, for in all this there is a kind of fashion, as with all things of our time. We do not mean that when a superstition arises, it at once replaces the others, for on the contrary we can easily observe their coexistence in the contemporary mentality, but at least the most recent takes a predominant place and relegates the others more or less to the background. Thus, keeping more specifically to what we presently have in view, it can be said that there was first the superstition of reason, which reached its culmination near the end of the 18th century. Then the superstition of science and progress closely attached to the former, but more particularly characteristic of the 19th century. More recently still, we see the appearance of the superstition of life, which had great success in the early years of the present century. As everything changes with an ever-increasing speed, these superstitions, like all the scientific and philosophical theories to which they are linked in a certain way, seem to wear out more and more rapidly. Thus, we must now note the emergence of yet another superstition, that of value, which apparently only dates from a few years back, but which is already tending to follow the steps of those that have preceded it. We are certainly not inclined to exaggerate the importance of philosophy, and above all, of modern philosophy, for while recognizing that it may be one of the factors that act more or less on the general mentality, we think that it is far from the most important, and that under its systematic form, it even represents more of an effect than a cause. As such, however, it expresses in a more clearly defined way what already existed in a diffused state in this mentality, and consequently, in somewhat the same way as a magnifying instrument, it reveals things that could otherwise escape the attention of the observer, or that would be at least more difficult to discern. Also, in order to understand fully what is involved, it helps to recall first of all the stages of the gradual decline of modern philosophical conceptions, which we have already pointed out elsewhere first. The reduction of all things to the human and to the rational, then the increasingly narrow meaning given to the rational itself, which in the end is envisaged only in its most inferior functions, and finally a descent into the infrarational, with so-called intuitionism, and the various theories that are more or less directly part of it. The rationalists at least still spoke of truth, although for them it could obviously only be a question of very relative truths. The intuitionists try to replace the true with the real, which could be almost the same thing if one kept to the normal meaning of words, but which is very far from being the case. In fact, for here one must take into account the strange deformation by which, in current usage, the word reality has come to designate exclusively things of the sensible order, which is to say precisely those that have the least degree of reality. Next, the pragmatists chose to ignore truth entirely, and to suppress it in a certain manner by substituting for it utility. This is then really the fall into the subjective, for it is quite clear that the utility of a thing is by no means a quality that resides in the thing itself, but depends entirely on the one who appraises it and who makes it the object of a kind of individual appreciation, without in the least concerning himself with what the thing is outside of this appreciation, that is to say, with all that it really is. Assuredly, it would be difficult to proceed any further on the path of the negation of all intellectuality. The intuitionists and the pragmatists, and likewise the representatives of some other related schools of lesser importance, willingly adorn their theories with the label philosophy of life, but it seems that already this expression no longer enjoys as much success as it once did, and that today it is the philosophy of values that is most in favour. This new philosophy appears to attack the real itself, however one wishes to understand it, almost as pragmatism attacks the true. Its affinity in certain respects with pragmatism is obvious, for both value and utility can be no more than a simple matter of individual appreciation, and its subjective character is perhaps even more accentuated, as will be made evident below. It is possible that the current success of the word value is due in part to the rather grossly material sense that, although not inherent to its original meaning, is associated with it in ordinary language. When one speaks of value or evaluation, one immediately thinks of something that can be counted or numbered, and it must be agreed that this accords quite well with the quantitative spirit characteristic of the modern world. However, this is at most only half the explanation. Indeed, it must be remembered that pragmatism, which is defined by the fact that it relates everything to action, does not only mean utility in a material sense, but also in a moral sense. Value is equally subject to these two meanings, although the second clearly predominates in the conception in question, for the moral, or more exactly moralist, aspect is still exaggerated. This philosophy of values appears above all as a form of idealism, and this no doubt explains its hostility towards the real, since it is understood that in the special language of modern philosophers, idealism is opposed to realism. It is known that for the most part modern philosophy thrives on ambiguity, and there is something noteworthy hidden in this label idealism. The word can in fact be derived both from idea and from ideal, and in fact the two essential characteristics that can easily be discerned in the philosophy of values corresponds to this twin derivation. Idea is of course taken here in the purely psychological sense, which is the only sense the moderns know, and it will be seen shortly that it is useful to emphasize this point in order to dispel yet another ambiguity. And this is the subjectivist side of the conception in question. As to the ideal, it represents no less obviously its moralist side. Thus, in this case, the two meanings of idealism are closely associated, and as it were support each other, because they both correspond to rather general tendencies of the contemporary mentality. Psychologism indicates a state of mind that is far from being peculiar to professional philosophers, and furthermore, the fascination which the empty word ideal has exercised on most of our contemporaries is only too well known. What is almost incredible is that the philosophy in question claims to have its root in Platonic idealism, and it is difficult to refrain from a certain stupefaction in seeing the assertion that true reality lies not in the object, but in the idea. That is to say, in an act of thought, attributed to Plato. First, there is no Platonic idealism in any of the meanings that the moderns give to the word idealism. For Plato, ideas are neither psychological nor subjective, and have absolutely nothing in common with an act of thought. On the contrary, they are the transcendent principles or archetypes of all things. That is why they constitute reality par excellence. And although Plato himself did not express it in this way, any more than he anywhere expressly formulates something that could be called a theory of ideas, one could say that the world of ideas is ultimately nothing other than the divine intellect. What connection can this have with the product of an individual thought? Even from the mere point of view of the history of philosophy, there is a truly extraordinary error here, and not only is Plato neither idealist nor subjectivist in any degree, but it would be impossible to be more completely realist than he. It is surely more than paradoxical that the avowed enemies of the real wish to make him their predecessor. Furthermore, these same philosophers commit yet another error that is hardly less serious when, in trying to connect their moralism to Plato, they invoke the central role, as it were, that he assigns to the idea of the good. Here, to use scholastic terminology, we can say that they quite simply confuse the transcendental good with the moral good. So great is their ignorance of certain notions, no matter how elementary. When one sees the moderns thus interpret ancient conceptions, even though no more than philosophy is involved, can one still be astonished how outrageously they deform doctrines of a more profound order? The truth is that the philosophy of values cannot claim the least connection with any ancient doctrine whatsoever, save in indulging in very poor puns on the ideas and the good, to which must be added yet other confusions, and rather common ones, such as that of spirit with mind. On the contrary, it is one of the most typically modern confusions arising from the subjectivist and moralist traits noted above. It is not difficult to understand at what point it is thereby opposed to the traditional spirit, as is all idealism moreover, the logical outcome of which is to make truth itself dependent on the operations of individual thought. At a time when intellectual disorder had not yet reached the point it has today, perhaps certain idealists sometimes retreated before the enormity of such a consequence. but we do not believe that contemporary philosophers have such reservations. But after all this, one may still wonder just what exactly is served by promoting this particular idea of value, thrust thus into the world like a new slogan, or if one wishes, a new suggestion. The answer to the question is also easy, if we simply consider that nearly the entire modern deviation could be described as a series of substitutions that amount to just so many falsifications in all orders. It is in fact easier to destroy a thing by claiming to replace it, even with a more or less crude parody, than to acknowledge openly that one wishes to leave behind only nothingness. And even when it is a question of a thing that already no longer in fact exists, one can still have an interest in devising an imitation in order to prevent anyone from feeling the need to restore it, or in order to create an obstacle for those who might in fact have such an intention. Thus, to take only one or two examples of the first case, the idea of free inquiry was invented in order to destroy spiritual authority, not by denying it purely and simply all at once, but by substituting for it a fake authority, that of individual reason. Or again, philosophical rationalism made a point of replacing intellectuality with what is only a caricature. For us, the idea of value seems to be connected rather to the second case. It is already a long time since anyone has in fact recognized any real hierarchy, that is, one founded essentially on the very nature of things. For one reason or another, a point we do not intend to investigate here, it seemed opportune, doubtless not to the philosophers, for in all likelihood they were merely the first dupes, to establish in the public mentality a false hierarchy based solely on sentimental appreciation and hence entirely subjective, and all the more innocuous from the point of view of modern egalitarianism, which finds itself thus consigned to the mists of the ideal, or one might say to the fancies of the imagination. One could say in sum that values represents a counterfeit of hierarchy used by a world that has been led to the negation of all true hierarchy. What is even less reassuring is that some dare to qualify these values as spiritual, and the abuse of this word is no less significant than all the rest. In fact, here we recognize another counterfeit, that of spirituality, the different forms of which we have already denounced. Would the philosophy of values also have some role to play in this connection? What, in any case, is not in doubt is that we are no longer at the stage where materialism and positivism exert a preponderant influence. Henceforth it is a question of something else, which, to fulfill its purpose, must assume a more subtle character. And to state clearly our complete thought on this point, in the order of philosophical ideas and by means of their reactions on the general mentality, idealism and subjectivism at present are and no doubt will increasingly be the principal obstacles to a full restoration of true intellectuality. The Misdeeds of Psychoanalysis. It will be found that the same anti-traditional forces are found in psychology, and in their more recent schools they assume a far more dangerous aspect, for instead of taking the form of mere theoretical postulates, they are given practical applications of a very disturbing character. The most representative of these new methods are grouped under the general heading of psychoanalysis. It may be noted that their handling of elements belonging to the subtle order is accompanied by a materialistic attitude, no doubt because of their earlier training, as well as because of their present ignorance of the true nature of the elements they are bringing into play. Is it not one of the strangest characteristics of modern science that it never knows exactly what the object of its studies really is, even when only the forces of the corporeal domain are in question. The case of Freud himself, the founder of psychoanalysis, is quite typical, for he never ceased to declare himself a materialist. One further remark. Why is it that the principal representatives of the new tendencies, like Einstein in physics, Bergson in philosophy, Freud in psychology, and many others of less importance, are almost all of Jewish origin, unless it is because there is something involved that is closely bound up with the malefic and dissolving aspect of nomadism, because that aspect must inevitably predominate in Jews who are detached from their own traditions. There is something certainly more than the mere question of vocabulary in the fact that present-day psychology considers nothing but the subconscious, and never the superconscious, which ought logically to be its correlative. There is no doubt that this usage expresses the idea of an extension operating only in a downwards direction. That is, towards the aspect of things that corresponds both here in the human being and elsewhere in the cosmic environment, to the fissures through which the most malefic influences of the subtle world penetrate. Influences having a character that can truthfully and literally be described as infernal. Freud, in fact, put at the head of his The Interpretation of Dreams the following very significant epigram: Flectere si nekeo superos, aceronta movebo. If I can't reach heaven, I will raise hell. There are also some who adopt the term unconscious as a synonym or equivalent of subconscious, and this term taken literally would seem to refer to an even lower level, but as a matter of fact it only corresponds less closely to reality. If the object of study were really unconscious, it is difficult to see how it could be spoken of at all, especially in psychological terms, and besides, what good reason is there other than mere materialistic and mechanistic prejudice for assuming that anything unconscious really exists? There is another thing worthy of note, and that is the strange illusion which leads psychologists to regard states as being more profound when they are quite simply more inferior. Is not this already an indication of the tendency to run counter to spirituality, which alone can be truly profound, since it alone touches the principle and the very centre of the being? Correspondingly, since the domain of psychology is not extended upwards, the superconscious naturally remains as strange to it and as cut off from it as ever. And when psychology happens to meet anything related to the superconscious, it tries to annex it merely by assimilating it to the subconscious. This particular procedure is almost invariably characteristic of its so-called explanations of such things as religion and mysticism, together with certain aspects of Eastern doctrine such as yoga. There are therefore features in this confusion of the superior with the inferior that can properly be regarded as constituting a real subversion. Psychology tends in its appeal to the subconscious to approach more and more closely to metapsychics, and in the same way it cannot avoid making an approach to spiritualism and to other more or less similar things, all of which rely without doubt on the same obscure elements of a debased psychism. These same things, of which the origin and the character are more than suspect, thus appear in the guise of precursory movements, and as the allies of recent psychology, which introduces the elements in question into the contemporary purview of what is admitted to be official science. And although it introduces them in a roundabout way, it is very difficult to think that the part psychology is called upon to play in the present state of the world is other than one of active participation in the second phase of anti-traditional action, In this connection, the recent mentioned pretensions of ordinary psychology to annex by forcible assimilation to the subconscious certain things that by their very nature elude it only belongs to what may be called the childish side of the affair, though they are fairly clearly subversive in tendency, just like the sociological explanations of the same things are really of a simplistic ingenuousness that sometimes reaches buffoonery. But in any case, that sort of thing is far less serious, so far as its real consequences are concerned, than the truly satanic side now to be examined more closely in relation to the new psychology. A satanic character is revealed with particular clarity in the psychoanalytic interpretations of symbolism, or of what is held rightly or wrongly to be symbolism, this last proviso being inserted because on this point, as on many others, if the details were gone into, there would be many distinctions to make and many confusions to dissipate. Psychologists of earlier schools had, of course, themselves often tried to explain symbolism in their own way, and to bring it within the range of their own conceptions. In any such case, if symbolism is really in question at all, explanations in terms of purely human elements fail to recognize anything that is essential, as indeed they do whenever affairs of a traditional order are concerned. If, on the other hand, human affairs alone are really in question, then it must be a case of false symbolism. But then the very fact of calling it by that name reveals once more the same mistake about the nature of true symbolism. And this applies equally to the matters to which the psychoanalysts devote their attention, but with the difference that, in their case, the things to be taken into consideration are not simply human, but also to a great extent infra-human. It is then that we come into the presence not only of a debasement, but of a complete subversion. And every subversion, even if it only arises at least in the first place from incomprehension and ignorance, is always inherently satanic in the true sense of the word. Besides this, the generally ignoble and repulsive character of psychoanalytical interpretations is an entirely reliable mark in this connection, and it is particularly significant from our point of view, as has been shown elsewhere, that this very same mark appears again in certain spiritualist manifestations. Anyone who sees in this no more than a mere coincidence must surely have much goodwill, if indeed he is not completely blind. In most cases, the psychoanalysts may well be quite unconscious, as are the spiritualists, of what is really involved in these matters, but the former, no less than the latter, appear to be guided by a subversive will, making use in each case of elements that are of the same order, if not precisely identical. This subversive will, whatever may be the beings in which it is incarnated, is certainly conscious enough, at least in those beings, and it is related to intentions that are doubtless very different from any that can be suspected by people who are only the unconscious instruments whereby those intentions are translated into action. Under these conditions, it is all too clear that a resort to psychoanalysis for purposes of therapy, this being the usual reason for its employment, cannot but be extremely dangerous for those who undergo it, and even to those who apply it, for they are concerned with things that can never be handled with impunity. It would not be taking an exaggerated view to see in this one of the means specially brought into play in order to increase to the greatest possible extent the disequilibrium of the modern world, and to lead it on towards final dissolution. Those who practice such methods are, on the other hand, without doubt, convinced of the benefits afforded by the results they obtain. Theirs is, however, the very delusion that makes the diffusion of these methods possible, and it marks the real difference subsisting between the intentions of the practitioners and the intentions of the will that presides over the work in which the practitioners only collaborate blindly. In fact, the only effect of psychoanalysis must be to bring to the surface, by making it fully conscious, the whole content of these lower depths of the being that can properly be called the subconscious. Moreover, the individual concerned is already psychologically weak by hypothesis, for if he were otherwise he would experience no need to resort to treatment of this description. He is by so much the less able to resist subversion, and he is in grave danger of foundering irremediably in the chaos of dark forces thus imprudently let loose. Even if he manages, in spite of everything, to escape, he would at least retain throughout the rest of his life an imprint like an ineradicable stain within himself. This descent into the infrahuman world, which is not followed by any reascent, is quite simply a fall into the mire, as it is called according to the symbolism of some of the ancient mysteries. It is known that this mire was figuratively represented as the road leading to Eleusis, and that those who fell into it were profane people who claimed initiation without being qualified to receive it, and so were only the victims of their own imprudence. It may be mentioned that such mires really exist in the macrocosmic as well as in the microcosmic order. This is directly connected with the question of the outer darkness. And certain relevant gospel texts could be recalled, the meaning of which agrees exactly with what has just been explained. In the descent into hell, the being finally exhausts certain inferior possibilities, in order to be able to rise thereafter to superior states. In the fall into the mire, on the other hand, the inferior possibilities take possession of him, dominate him, and end by submerging him completely. There was occasion in the previous paragraph to use the word counterfeit. The impression it conveys is greatly strengthened by some other considerations, such as the denaturing of symbolism previously mentioned, and the same kind of denaturing tends to spread to everything that contains any element of a superhuman order, as is shown by the attitude adopted towards religion. Freud devoted a book specifically to the psychoanalytical interpretations of religion, in which his own conceptions are combined with totemism of the sociological school. Even doctrines of a metaphysical order such as yoga do not escape this new kind of interpretation, which is carried to such a point that some proceed to assimilate the methods of spiritual realization to the therapeutical procedures of psychoanalysis. This is something even worse than the cruder deformations also current in the West, such as those in which the methods of yoga are seen as a sort of physical culture. The subtler kind are the more dangerous, and not simply because they are liable to lead astray minds on which the less subtle could obtain no hold. They are certainly dangerous for that reason, but there is another reason affecting a much wider field, identical with that which has been described as making the materialistic conception less dangerous than conceptions involving recourse of an inferior psychism. Of course, the purely spiritual aim, which alone constitutes the essentiality of yoga as such, and without which the very use of the word becomes a mere absurdity, is no less completely unrecognized in the one case than in the other. Yoga is in fact no more a kind of psychic therapy than it is a kind of physiological therapy, and its methods are in no way and in no degree a treatment for people who are ill in any way or unbalanced. Very far from that. They are, on the contrary, intended exclusively from those who must, from the start, and in their own natural dispositions, be as perfectly balanced as possible if they are to realize the spiritual development which is the only object of the methods. But all these matters, as will readily be understood, are strictly linked with the whole question of initiatic qualification. But this is not yet all. For one other thing under the heading of counterfeit is perhaps even more worthy of note than anything mentioned so far, and that is the requirement imposed on anyone who wants to practice psychoanalysis as a profession of being first psychoanalyzed himself. This implies above all a recognition of the fact that the being who has undergone this operation is never again the same as he was before. In other words, to repeat an expression already used above, it leaves in him an ineradicable imprint, as does initiation, but as it were in an opposite sense, from what is here in question is not a spiritual development, but the development of an inferior psychism. In fact, there is an evident imitation of the initiatic transmission, but bearing in mind the difference in the nature of the influences that intervene, and in view of the fact that the production of an effective result does not allow the practice to be regarded as nothing but a mere pretense, without real significance, the psychoanalytic transmission is really more comparable to the transmission effected in a domain such as that of magic, or even more accurately that of sorcery. And there remains yet another very obscure point concerning the actual origin of the transmission. It is obviously impossible to give to anyone else what one does not possess oneself, and moreover the invention of psychoanalysis is quite recent. So from what source did the first psychoanalysts obtain the powers that they communicate to their disciples, and by whom were they themselves psychoanalyzed in the first place? To ask this question is only logical, at least for anyone capable of a little reflection, though it is probably highly indiscreet, and it is more than doubtful whether a satisfactory answer will ever be obtained. But even without any such answer, this kind of psychic transmission reveals a truly sinister mark in the resemblance it calls to mind. From this point of view, psychoanalysis presents a rather terrifying likeness to certain sacraments of the devil. Thunderbolts as symbols. Origer, speaking of Arcanum 16, has written, "It seems that a relationship exists between the Hall of Stones, which surround the thunderstruck tower, and the word Bethel, the dwelling place of the divine, from which Beitel is derived, a word by which the Semites designated meteorites, or thunderstones. Here we find several quite distinct symbols. First of all, it is certain that the symbolic function of meteorites, or stones fallen from heaven, is very important, because these are the black stones that feature in so many different traditions. From the stone which represented Cybele, or the great goddess, to the stone which is enshrined in the Kaaba at Mecca, and which plays a part in the story of Abraham. At Rome, too, there was the lapis niger, not to mention the sacred shields of the Salians, that are said to have been hewn from a meteorite in the time of Numa. Ozendowski also told the story of a black stone, which was sent of old by the king of the world to the Dalai Lama, then carried to Orga in Mongolia, and which disappeared a century ago. These black stones are certainly to be counted as Beitels, that is, stones considered as dwelling places of the divine, or in other words, as the vehicles of certain spiritual influences. But do all Beitels have this provenance? We think not, and in particular we see nothing to justify the supposition that such was the case with the stone to which Jacob, according to the Genesis account, gave the name Bethel, a name applied by extension to the place itself, where he had had his vision while his head was resting on the stone. The Beitel, strictly speaking, represents the Omphalos, and as such it is a symbol of the centre of the world, which quite naturally is identified with the dwelling place of God. This stone took different forms, such as for example that of a pillar. It is thus that Jacob says, and this stone which I have erected as a pillar shall be the house of God. Now among the Celtic peoples too, certain menhirs, if not all, had the same significance. The omphalos could also be represented by a stone of conical shape, like the black stone of Cybele, or egg-shaped. The cone recalled the form of the sacred mountain, symbol of the pole or of the world axis. The ovoid form is directly related to another very important symbol, that of the world egg. In all cases, the beetle was a prophetic stone, a stone which speaks, that is, a stone which yielded oracles, or near to which oracles were given, thanks to the spiritual influences of which it was the vehicle. And so the beetles are therefore essentially sacred stones. But not all of them were celestial in origin. So aeroliths themselves are stones from heaven. But the term must not be limited to them alone, for it is said in Genesis that the first name of the Bethel of Jacob was precisely Luz, and we may even recall at this point that the Grail was said to have been carved from a stone which also had fallen from heaven. On the question of beetles in general, or of black stones, it is true that neither one or the other really have anything in common with the symbol of the thunderbolt. It is indeed tempting to suppose that lightning stones or thunder stones must be stones fallen from heaven, aeroliths, but in reality it seems they are not. We could never have guessed what they are without having learned the truth from the peasants who, through their oral tradition, have retained the memory of it. Moreover, these peasants themselves are mistaken in their own interpretation of it. Their belief that the stones have fallen with the lightning, or they are lightning itself, which shows that the true sense of the tradition eludes them. They say in fact that thunder falls in two ways, in fire or in stone. In the first case it sets fire, while in the second it only shatters. But they know the thunderstones very well, and they are mistaken only in attributing to them, because of their name, a celestial origin, which they do not have and never did have. The truth is that what is called lightning stones are in fact stones which symbolize the lightning. They are nothing other than prehistoric flint axes, just as the serpent's egg, the druid symbol of the world egg, is in its material form nothing other than the fossil sea urchin. The stone axe is the stone which shatters and splits, and this is why it represents the lightning bolt. This symbolism furthermore goes back to an extremely remote period, and it explains the existence of certain axes that archaeologists call votive axes. Ritual objects that never had a practical use as arms or as implements of any kind, and this leads us quite naturally to recall the stone axe of Parashurama and the stone hammer of Thor are really one and the same weapon, and that weapon is moreover the symbol of the thunderbolt. This thunderbolt symbolism is thus of Hyperborean origin, which means that it belongs to the most ancient of all the traditions of the cycle of humanity, to what is truly the primal tradition for the present Maha Yuga. We find the thunderbolt also accorded a high position in Tibetan symbolism. The Vajra that it represents is one of the principal insignia of the dignitaries of Lamaism. At the same time, the Vajra symbolizes the masculine principle of universal manifestation, and thus the thunderbolt is associated with the idea of divine paternity, an association also to be found quite clearly in Western antiquity, inasmuch as the thunderbolt is the principal attribute of Zeus Pater, or Jupiter, the father of gods and men. Moreover, he destroyed the Titans and the giants by Thunderbolts just as Thor and Parashurama destroyed their equivalents with weapons of stone. There is, even in the modern West, another parallel which is truly unexpected. Leibniz, in his Monadology, says that all created monads are born, so to speak, by continuous fulgurations of the divinity from moment to moment. Thus, in conformity with the traditional data we have just been discussing, he associates the thunderbolt, French foudre and the Latin fulgur, with the idea of the production of creatures. One last point we will mention is the Masonic symbolism of the mallet. Not only is there an obvious connection between the mallet and the hammer, which are, so to speak, two forms of the same tool, but the English Masonic historian R.F. Gould thinks that the mallet of the master originates from the hammer of Thor, and also note that the Gauls had a god of the mallet, who appears on an old altar discovered at Mayence. It would even seem that this is the Dis Pater, whose name is quite close to that of Zeus Pater, and whom the Druids, according to Caesar, said was the father of the Gallic race. Thus the mallet appears again as a symbolic equivalent of the Vajra of the Oriental traditions, and so, by a coincidence that is undoubtedly not fortuitous but which will come as a surprise to many, the Master Masons have an attribute which has exactly the same meaning as that of the Grand Lamas of Tibet. But who in Freemasonry as it exists today could boast of actually possessing the mysterious power? One in its essence, though doubling in its apparently contrary effects, of which the emblem is the sign. We believe that it is not an exaggeration to say that, in what still subsists of the initiatic organizations of the West, no one any longer has even a remote idea of what is involved. The symbol remains, but when the spirit has withdrawn, it is nothing more than an empty form. Should we continue to hope, in spite of everything, that the day will come when this form will be revived, to respond once again to the reality which is the original point of its existence, and which alone confers on it a true initiatic character?